what would your definition be of narcissistic leadership?
We're talking about a fortress with defensive walls.
What do we look for in healthy leadership? Because if I don't know what I'm looking for, I won't know when I've found it.
If we don't deal with the trauma, what ends up happening is our nervous systems are left in perpetual activation.
What are some steps I can take to grow emotionally so that I become a better, healthier leader?
Well, Bob, I just want to talk about your feelings from here on out.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm open.
We've been getting lots of free therapy. Join the party, wander around our psyches. There's not a lot of Disney endings in life. And I loved it. It just resonated with me so much. Welcome to Project Healed, the bridge between trauma, faith, and wholeness, with your hosts, Bob and Erica Hazlett.
We are so excited about this episode. We have Dr. Chuck DeGroat. He is a professor, a therapist, and author of two amazing books, When Narcissism Comes to Church and Healing What's Within. And he's got another book coming up we're going to talk about. Welcome, Chuck. So great to have you with us.
Thank you both. Thanks for having me.
My question is narcissism just clickbait? Is it pop psychology? Or is it more pervasive than we know? What would your definition be of narcissistic leadership?
Yeah, well, the dynamics of narcissism are certainly something that we've all seen for years and years. And of course, you could trace it in scripture, right? From Genesis 3 on to the Kings to, there are all sorts of characters in scripture and church history that you might say are grandiose or attention seeking. That's when we're talking about narcissism, that's what we're getting at. I often say that I'm very careful to diagnose narcissism. I want to do testing. I want to do interviews. I want to do assessment. But it's thrown around a lot in our culture, right? When we're talking about narcissism, when we describe it, we often use the language of the Bible of psychology, the DSM, where we talk about grandiosity and attention seeking and a lack of empathy. But for those of us who do the work, we're not just interested in the personality, because there are a lot of people who might appear to have narcissistic personalities. They're kind of charismatic. They are kind of attention seeking, approval seeking. But what we're really looking at with narcissism, at least in my work, is a kind of defensive structure of the personality, a personality organized around self-protection and defense. And that's not what you often see immediately. That's often what you see when someone is confronted or when someone fails, when there's some sort of scandal or moral failure. That's when you see the abundance of self-protection and defensiveness come up. And so there are some personality characteristics that you might name that psychologists agree on, that grandiosity, that attention seeking, etc. But we're talking about a deeper structure of the personality, and that's why we need to be careful about how we use the language of narcissism.
So the term narcissistic personality disorder is in the DSM-5, which is the book that, all social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists use to diagnose someone. So it's, as just a person walking around, I don't just walk around and sort of say, oh, that person has cancer, or, oh, that person has liver failure, or that person has whatever. But I feel like the word narcissism has gotten so used on social media that it has empowered people to kind of just put that term onto people with maybe perhaps not even understanding that this is actually a very complex disorder that is formed possibly even from birth. And so it's not something that is just, I think we're also living in a very narcissistic culture. And so there's an expression that's taking place of where narcissistic traits seem to be traits that succeed. So my question would be, how does it feel to be in a church as a church parishioner? What are some of the feelings you might have that would help for you to identify if this is a narcissistic culture or there's a narcissistic leader?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think you're getting at a better angle here, a better question, right? How do you experience the leadership? Maybe we don't worry so much about a label. At first, we can get there. But, when I'm doing consulting, I'm not coming in first with a label. I'm coming in with the very question that you have. And that's the question of how are you experiencing the leadership? And I think when you're in a narcissistic system, I'm in the book, I name a number of the characteristics of narcissistic leaders, but you're going to have this sense that the gravitational force is around this particular person, that where they walk, how they speak, most people are sort of gravitating toward them, and they want you to mirror them. They want to hear affirmation, right? They may not demand loyalty, but they certainly are entitled to your loyalty, or so they think, right? And when they don't experience your unmitigated loyalty, you're going to sense it. You're going to be ostracized or distanced or silenced in one way or another. And if you can find your way back to affirmation, you may be let back in. And so there's this sense that if you're in a system like this, you're exhausted. You're constantly gaslighting yourself. What am I doing? What am I doing wrong? What am I saying wrong? What did I say to merit his disapproval? How did I get back into his favor? And so most that I work with in systems like this are really exhausted. They feel crazy. And oftentimes when I talk about narcissism, I say it is crazy making, because you feel tied up in knots psychologically in a system like this.
Yeah, and I love this conversation because it brings us into a conversation about not just professional development and spiritual development, but emotional development, and that's been a big part of the conversation. I think over the last 10 years, it has come into church leadership language, and so some leaders aren't necessarily narcissistic, but they just haven't grown emotionally. So one of the things I love that you do, and thank you for your work, is you help leaders to grow. So if I'm a leader and I don't want to be this, I don't want to be a narcissist, like what are some steps I can take to grow emotionally so that I become a better, healthier leader?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're right. There have been, I've been writing books since 2010, and a number of us have been writing about emotional and spiritual health, particularly for leaders. And so when you raise a question like that, I think there are many of us, I know you interviewed Pasta Vigian recently, many of us have been doing this work for a while who are disappointed that there hasn't been the fruit of that hard work over the last 20, 25 years on emotional health, relational health, spiritual health. That said, I think you know this, I've got another book coming out called Who You're Becoming, on cultivating character change in a narcissistic age. And one of the things I talk about in there is, the building blocks are begin with self-awareness. Self-awareness is something that we've been talking about for a long, long time. St. Augustine in the Christian tradition wrote his Confessions, and as the very first autobiographer. For those I say that for those who are skeptical when someone like me talks about self-awareness, because it's a deep value within the Christian tradition. And self-awareness gets at how people experience us, how we show up, our relational styles, things like that. But one of the other pieces that I'm talking a lot about these days is what we might call self-regulation. You'll see this language, by the way, if you're engaged in conversation on emotional intelligence, or EQ, where self-awareness and self-regulation are number 1 and 2 in terms of the characteristics of emotional intelligence. And self-regulation really gets at the underlying anxiety. And what we see in narcissistic leaders is a dysregulated nervous system.
Yeah.
In other words, you can feign self-awareness. I'm an Enneagram 1. I'm an Enneagram 7. You know that I'm a kind of a big personality.
Yeah.
People experience me in this
I'm
way.
intense. Yeah.
What's that?
I'm intense.
I'm intense. And they'll say things like that, but they're not aware of the underlying autonomic energy. And so as we're doing this work therapeutically, what we're attending to is the story of dysregulation. In other words, in this person's story, they likely very early on in life adapted in some way because of the pain that they experienced, in a way that where they become grandiose, where they become attention seeking, where they become entitled, where they are a force to be reckoned with. And now it's causing damage. And that's a dysregulated nervous system uh, um, that is showing up in a ministry context where the outside looks good, it looks charismatic, it looks inspiring, but the inside is deeply dysregulated, profoundly anxious, and living in a kind of survival mode.
So you've been doing emotional work with leaders now for 25 years.
Yeah.
What's the thing or the things that have surprised you or shocked you as you've gotten deeper and deeper into this work that you weren't expecting?
Well, I sort of hinted at this, but I do think that those of us who started that long ago had a sense that there would be measurable growth.
Hope.
Yeah.
You had hope.
I think, I started in the late 90s. My first book came out in 2010. The Narcissism book came out in 2020, alongside some other great books by a colleague of Boz's in the consultation field, Wade Mullen, Diane Langford, Scott McKnight, Laura Barringer, an abundance of resources on spiritual abuse, Lisa Oakley and others. And we kind of thought, well, here we go. There's a moment of reckoning and things are beginning to change. Not only are we talking about emotional and spiritual health, the health of the leader, now we're reckoning with the debris field of damage from abusive leaders.
Yeah.
And I think that there was a sense, at least when we talk to each other and have conversations offline, I think there was a sense that this moment of reckoning will really be the moment that bears the greater fruit long term. I think what we're seeing is a kind of equal and opposite reaction from the other side. It's sort of a doubling down in politically, ecclesially, where there's this sense that narcissism is on the rise again, that some of the things that feed narcissistic leadership are actually growing within systems. And so I think there's some discouragement alongside the hope that there are a growing number of resources that I'm sure are helping you, have helped move along the way too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, I can remember where I first became aware of, my need to grow emotionally. I in 2016, I went through a intense personal betrayal, and I woke up for months in the middle of the night, and I would just find myself like in the fetal position, weeping, just weeping. And I having a conversation with myself, with the spirit, saying, what is this? And I felt like I understood for the first time, this is feelings, I'm like, I don't like feelings. I didn't know I had feelings. I don't like feelings, and why are these feelings here? And I realized it's because I cared. And I think it was Peter Scazzaro's book, Emotionally Healthy Leadership, I think it's called, right? That helped me a lot, right?
Emotionally healthy leader.
Yes. And so, like, that was the beginning of my journey. So is there a story in your life you could share with us how you kind of like confronted that moment of pain and how you helped grow through that?
Yeah. Well, Bob, I just want to talk about your feelings from here on out.
Okay. Yeah, let's do it. I'm open. I've been sitting with therapists in this chair for the last 2 days, so don't worry.
We've been getting lots of free therapy. Join the party, wander around our psyches. We're here for it.
Well, I think, I often talk about the dashboard, the first dashboard that where you experience, kind of like you're driving a car, your dashboard, there are lights that indicate that there might be a problem, right? And that dashboarding includes your thoughts and your feelings and your bodily intuitions, your relationships, your behaviors, and so on. And what I hear from you is there's something there that begin to tell you something's up here and I need to pay attention.
Yes.
And
that was beginning of self-awareness, pain.
Right. That's right. That's where it starts, right? And so for me, it goes all the way back to my late 20s when I went to seminary and I had all the answers. Believe it or not, I had all the answers before I went to seminary, or so I thought. And I was sort of caught in my certainty and my arrogance. There was a particular counseling professor who said some hard things to me and invited me to look at my life. And I ended up getting into a master's program in counseling at the seminary alongside my Master of Divinity. And that counseling program that was transformational for me. This journey actually began in my late 20s, and it was rough. I mean, I was called out, the things that were named, the things I began to discover about myself my emotions, my own body, how I was showing up in relationships. Those were all things that I needed to reckon with. But alongside that, I started to reckon with my own experiences of spiritual abuse. I was actually in a spiritually abusive relationship, not a dating. I was married at the time, but a larger ecclesial relationship at the time, where it was the first time in the late '90s that I began to name spiritual abuse. And back then, there were very few resources for these sorts of things. So, it was a tougher time. It was a more challenging time, as probably a lot of your listeners know, maybe you know as well, to name these things, because there wasn't this kind of conversation that you're cultivating out there.
For me, I was a part of Bethel Church from my earliest times of spiritual development, like right after I became a Christian. And I was, pretty up close with a lot of leaders from a lot of different movements. I interned with leaders. I spent a lot of times, in a lot of different movements, from International House of Prayer, Kansas City, to Bethel Church and others. And I had a hard time reconciling, because I wasn't raised as a Christian, a lot of the things that I was seeing in the environment, especially as a young single female. And at the time, I was a young single female preacher, which was even harder. And a lot of the experience I had were very heartbreaking to me. And I didn't see pathways to fix them. Like, I didn't feel like institutionally that there would really be change. And it was really sad for me. And so I really felt like that was the point when I decided to actually start a 501c3 nonprofit, an anti-human trafficking organization, and step out of ministry and go into the nonprofit space. And I found, as soon as I did that, I found out that all of a sudden I felt very empowered, and I felt very received, and I felt very supported in the vision that I wanted to build and the vision that I had inside me. And it was just a very different experience. I love Jesus. I love the bride of Christ. I've been hurt. I've probably been a part of that hurt, sadly. But I really do have such a deep heart for the pain of the body of Christ. And, as these conversations and a lot of these exposures over the last several years have really started to come out and really hurt so many people, Bob and I just really wanted to create a space to create a conversation that would help to put language to people's pain. Because I feel like until you put language to the pain, until you kind of have the right words to name something's not right, I don't feel like this is a safe place for me to be. I don't feel like this is a safe place for me to worship. I don't feel like I'm, as a person of who I am, being respected or received. And I think what's hard, and what I really had to grapple with as a young single woman, was that I didn't really feel like there was safety in the structure there for me. And so I felt like I had to go build my own road. And, I think that path, even though sometimes it feels like a lonely one, is actually a really beautiful one, because I went with Jesus, and I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to rescue and recover children from human trafficking. Like, yes, I had my master's in social work, and I worked in social work and those sorts of things. But the actual process was one that I had to build a lot of support and a lot of voices and a lot of resources around me. But, seeing the pain that's happening right now, I'd really love if you could speak to people who have been hurt by these exposures, who have felt like, I had no idea this was happening, or I had some idea, but I didn't know about this. They're shocked, they're disillusioned. And where do we go from here?
Where do we go?
Yeah, where do we go from here? That's a good question. Well, the first thing I'd say is what you experienced, we would name not just a spiritual abuse, but spiritual trauma. And, abuse really names what happened to you. And a lot of people talk about spiritual abuse, but we really need to shift the conversation after a bit to trauma. And that's what lingers within you. And two of the things that I heard what you said was powerlessness and aloneness. Those are the two major ingredients of spiritual trauma. And what's interesting is when you look at the life of Jesus, powerlessness and aloneness are right there, in his last days. That's what he experienced. And so there's a trauma that actually maybe even connects us to the life of Jesus and allows us some sense of comfort in the midst of that. But I think, where the conversation needs to go, I think, is if we're left merely with the wounds of abuse, and if we don't deal with the trauma, what ends up happening is our nervous systems are left in perpetual activation. Our bodies are left in survival mode. We're left in fight or flight. And we see a lot of that. And one of the things I often say about the larger spiritual abuse conversation is that there are sectors of it that aren't healthy because they continue to live in reactivity, even in polarization, and there hasn't been healing yet. That's why I like the work that you all are aiming toward here, Project Healing, right? Like there's this sense that the healing journey actually takes a long time, and it invites us into that powerlessness and into that aloneness. And now I'm talking as a therapist, right? Mm-hmm. But that's a journey that one needs to go on that, where you recognize that you may not get the justice that you want or even deserve, right? I mean, I had a significant experience of being fired back in 2003. I never did get the justice that I longed for, and I wanted it for about a decade. But I had to go on my own healing journey, and as I went on that journey, I realized you were so alone, and you felt so powerless in the midst of that, and that lingered in my body, and actually landed me in the hospital in April 2012. That's another story I can tell another time. Yeah, the body keeps the score, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I think part of where this conversation needs to go. And of course, I'm biased. I do the therapeutic work, is in the direction of that kind of healing.
Absolutely. I mean, we're a big believer in the healing power of Jesus, but he heals through people. Mm-hmm. And I think for a while in the church, the idea of psychology and therapeutic help has been separated from spirituality, but thankfully we're in a time where it's coming back.
Yes, actually, I took a really interesting course on when we decided to do Project Healed. I decided to get some additional certificates, and I took a really interesting course on religion, spirituality, and mental health. And the research is now showing that people who are not just spiritual, but are spiritual and religious show a 63% what they call more human flourishing, positive results across the board in their life than people who say they don't have spirituality or say they have spirituality without religion. And these are Harvard University studies. So these are studies that are put together by people of multiple types of faith. So there actually is a new push in the mental health field to bring religion and spirituality back into mental health, which I have a lot of hope about. I'm not sure where my hope level is right now with the institutional church, but I have a lot of hope about seeing the tools of the mental health area married with, the spirituality and religion, healthy religion.
Yeah, that what you're saying is important. And it's interesting. I think what we're getting to in the therapeutic world, the psychological world, is the end of self-help. I mean, I think we're realizing that's fruitless. We can't do this on our own. And so you're seeing, some of the leaders, some of the biggest psychological programs today, as you hinted at, now giving courses on the spirituality of their particular system. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because there's this deep longing in the human heart for some sense of belonging, right? And so, one of the aches so many of us have, and you name this, Erica, is this ache around the church, the institutional church, and how we've been hurt, right? And I think for those of us who maybe can't find a home in the church, we're looking for some sense of belonging. Yeah. And so it's understandable what's happening right now. And I think there's going to be this continued search for belonging, for meaning, even if people start to find it in different kinds of places.
So if someone has that ache, that they've been through spiritual trauma, what are the steps that you would suggest that they take to heal?
Well, I mean, I think it can't be done alone. That would be the first thing that I'd say. And one of the things we know about trauma is that trauma metastasizes in aloneness. And so you've got to find your way to someone who cares. That may be a friend who's attuned to you. That may be a spiritual director. That might be a really healthy pastor. That may be a therapist. But that's where it begins, because we know that healing from trauma begins with someone bearing witness to our life. That sense that you're not crazy. I see you. I see what's hurt you. It makes so much sense that you're in so much pain. That's where we begin. But of course, I'd say that's not where we end. There's a process that we need to go through of identifying how this has landed in our body, how we're holding it, and getting real clear on that, so that we can begin to shift into a place of more health, more wholeness, more connection, more safety. Second, I'd say we need to look at our own stories, and we need to ask the question, well, how did I land here? What in my life that sort of led to this? But by all means, what I'd say probably more than anything is find a safe place, find a safe person, because what causes trauma is threat, a threat to our nervous system, the actual threat that we experienced with a narcissistic leader and a toxic church system. And the remedy is to place a person of safety.
Wow, that's so helpful. And I want to talk for a minute about the person that feels trapped, maybe by loyalty, salary, a staff member. I have had a personal experience where, I was in a church relationship where I was threatened with reputational harm if I left. I was able to navigate that because I had good help, but there might be people like you experienced something like this. What would you tell the younger Chuck or that staff member that feels trapped? How can they exit or in a healthy manner?
Yeah, well, so that's so common, right? And I know both of you have experienced this, heard the stories, and I think it's really important in situations like that, I'm going to say it once again, to find someone who can walk with you in it. Oftentimes, this is what happened to me back in 2003. I didn't have anyone walking with me, and so I became reactive, and my reactivity led to me being fired. Now, that's not to minimize the actual harm that I was experiencing, but the reality is that there was no one to come alongside me and to say, hey, Chuck, beginning to notice that your nervous system is in fight or flight quite a bit, and so I needed some accompaniment. I needed some care in that season. And so what I'd say is, can you find your way to someone who's relatively safe, someone who cares? I know in a number of systems that I've done consulting with, and over the years, I've heard these kinds of stories for 20 years. In some of the larger churches, some of the more famous ones, some of those we know, some of the headliner churches where there has been spiritual and emotional abuse, there is often a person within that system who sees and cares. It may be someone who's trapped in the system himself or herself, but find your way to that other person so that you don't feel alone, so that you don't feel crazy, so that you don't gaslight yourself. That's where we start. Now, I would say the second piece of that is very subjective. When I walk with people, we have to think very carefully sometimes about how they exit a system, because their livelihood may be at stake. I'm thinking of a single woman who I worked with she was like, I can't leave this job. I've got 2 kids in daycare. I can't afford to do anything else, and so we need to think very carefully about, her safety and her care and her particular needs. And those are very, subjective conversations.
So what if you were talking to someone who loves their church, is plugged into a great church with a healthy church culture? Let me know where you're at if you do. Just DM Stella's where
We're coming. We'll move.
But if you're talking to someone who's plugged into a safe church, healthy church culture, and they have a friend who's experienced this, how can that friend support them if someone's on a journey of, it doesn't feel safe for me to go to church right now. It doesn't feel safe for me to sort of be in a greater church area. How would they support their friend?
Yeah, well, that's difficult, especially if someone hasn't experienced it, right? And I think all of us have known that person who's tried to be a friend, but offers the pat answers and this, yeah, here's a Bible verse for you, or I know everything's going to be better, right? That's not very helpful in seasons like this. I think a good friend expresses empathy. And what I mean by empathy is, tell me about your experience of that from the inside. Tell me what it's like for you. So rather than the emphasis is being on my anxiety as a friend, like I want to make you feel better, the emphasis is on you and your experience. How can I come alongside you? What do you need right now? Without judgment, without shame. Because frankly, there are a lot of us who have at one time or another stepped away from church, have experienced judgment, as if we're leaving Jesus, And so there's some sense that it's a friend who comes alongside with profound empathy, care, a person who sees you, but not a person who shames or judges you.
So in your book, Healing What's Within, you talk at one point about there's not a lot of Disney endings in life. And I loved it. It just resonated with me so much. I was there's really not. You really don't have a lot of Disney endings.
They were in my head, but they didn't happen.
Yeah, when I was 20. Well, you talked earlier about justice and feeling this sense of justice after spiritual abuse and wanting to see justice. Can you talk to me about your wrestle with that, and what does justice after having been spiritually abused from God look like?
Great question.
Yeah. Well, we're living in a particularly privileged time, if you think about it, where we do have Disney movies and where we have all kinds of technologies that help us to live the kinds of lives we want to live. And, we're not living as people did 1,000 years ago with the imminent threat of invasion from the other tribe or something like that, right? And so we are living a kind of this myth of eternal happiness. I'm entitled to, maybe that's our collective narcissism. I'm entitled to happiness, entitled to that Disney ending. And this is where I think we might even lean into our friends on the margins or our friends of color. Or, I live in a community here within our seminary community, a community of women and men with disabilities who will say, there's this long arc of justice. We've been waiting a long, long time. I have to wait a little longer too, and I've had friends of color say to me, sometimes you come off as like you deserved it yesterday, when it might not ever happen. And for some of us, we've got to reckon with that. And those are the kinds of folks who find their way to lament Psalms, for instance, those not just Psalms, but places in Scripture where all there is grief and crying out. And sometimes it feels like, as C.S. Lewis says, in A Grief Observed, like God is on the other side of the door, that the door has been locked and double locked, and God isn't answering, certainly not opening. That's the reality that some of us live in. And I want to honor that. If you've got listeners who are in that place, it might just feel like that. And there may not be, at least on this side of a new heavens and new earth, that kind of ending that you want. However, if you can find your way, as I mentioned, to places of safety and care and connection where, you can begin to stabilize and you can begin to work through what's happened, where you can grieve and where you might even find some sense of care and belonging, that's our best chance at, I think, an ending where there's some redemption. It might not be the Disney ending, but it might be a redemptive ending.
Yes. And grief has come up a lot in our conversations with different people. And one quote from Walter Brueggemann has come up again and again: grief is the doorway to the new. And so thank you for reminding us of that. Now, let's talk about the villains. What about leaders that have harmed people? Can narcissists actually change?
Well, that's maybe one of the top 3 questions that I get.
Yeah. I'm leaning in. I'm ready. I've got popcorn.
Recently I started a YouTube channel where I'm starting to tackle these kinds of questions, because it's like I needed to kind of put them out there somewhere. I've resisted that for so many years, but I figure I'm 56 years now, old now, so maybe I'm beginning to get over a little ego and I can do something like that. But anyway, one of the things I say about this is that when we're talking about narcissism, and I get that question, do narcissists change? we've got to distinguish between someone on the spectrum of narcissism and someone who's diagnosably narcissistic personality disorder, right? But there are narcissistic tendencies, and you and I have seen this in leaders who, appear entitled and appear charismatic and grandiose and things like that. The big difference between that, those are folks who might show up in those ways, but when you tell them about it, they're at least willing to enter into a conversation with a little bit less reactivity and defensive-ness. When we're talking about narcissistic personality disorder, like I said earlier, we're talking about a personality structure. Yeah. We're talking about a fortress with defensive walls, right? And so the work, if we're going to do the work, takes a whole lot longer for those walls to come down. So theoretically, yes, can a narcissist change? But now there are different types of narcissism, right?
And also when it's just repeated, when they've had opportunity after opportunity to feel the remorse and the pain of what they've done, and godly sorrow leads to repentance. It's not just a change of a thought process. Yeah. And I love the work that you do, because you talk about the work you do in restoring leaders, and I know that's part of your heart. But I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the process of restoration, and do we do it too quickly? Is there a better way to do it? Talk to us about that, because I know you have some work that you're coming out with soon.
Well, I think you're right. Godly sorrow leads to repentance. And I think, another Puritan said, repentance is a grief and a hatred of your sin. We want to see that. Obviously, we want to see that. But that's the tiny little seed. That's where we begin. We want to see, as Diane Langberg says over and over again, we want to see this a new and consistent shift over time. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're talking about years and years, right? And so the 2-week retreat that he gets away for, the 3-month restoration process, that's not enough. And oftentimes, at least some of the folks that I've worked with, they're good enough. They're the word I use is they're vulnerable enough, FAUX, vulnerable enough, to therapists who do not understand dynamics of narcissism and abuse. Wow. And so they can look like heroes to the therapist. They know their Enneagram number, and they know their family of origin story. They're really good talkers, Yeah. And so we need to see a major shift that begins with that repentance, that grief and hatred of their sin, that godly sorrow. But we need that to be consistent over the course of many, many months and years. And frankly, and this is, what the new book gets into, is that work. What does that look like at a deeply structural level in the human person, right? But one of the things I get at is what we do is we replace that with microwavable kinds of interventions, the 2 weeks away, the 3-month sabbatical, therapy intensive, the retreat. And we need to be very clear that those kinds of things might be helpful, but some of these folks are so committed to living in this narcissistic and defensive fortress that you really need someone with some expertise who understands the architecture of narcissism to work with them to undo that.
Okay, so I feel like you've done a really excellent job, including in your books. Please read When Narcissism Comes to the Church, and also Healing What's Within. You've done a really great job of providing some pathways to healing. I guess my question would be, what do we look for in healthy leadership? Because if I don't know what I'm looking for, I won't know when I've found it. So what are the qualities and character traits of healthy leaders?
Well, let me go in two directions with this. On the one hand, I think for a number of years, as we talked about before, we've been talking a lot about emotional health and emotional intelligence, things like self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, congruency, which means integrity of heart, social awareness. And those are really good measures that help us sort of determine health. But I'd want to go a step further and invite us to begin using some of the more classic language a little bit more regularly: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, etc. Right? Like I'd love for us to begin thinking about the way of Jesus, the way of downward mobility, Philippians chapter 2, which is to say that there can be this pretense, as I mentioned earlier, of self-awareness. I've been to therapy, I know my Enneagram, and yet not the requisite humility, not the gentleness, not even the joy that we want to see in a healthy leader. And so I think we're so starved for leaders, mentors, sages, adults in our lives who live out this humility. The people who get the attention, the people who get the clicks, are the people who show up in these ways that appear more narcissistic, right? Yeah. They're practically demanding attention. I know a lot of pastors, you were talking about healthy churches earlier, who exemplify love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. They're just not on the internet. They're just not, you're not going to find them on social media. Their churches don't appear in the Julie Roy's report, and these kinds of places. They're simply doing the work in a faithful way, and they don't really care about clicks. And so if we can find our way to telling some of those stories, one of those stories is 2 blocks down from where I'm sitting right now. My dear friend John Brown is the pastor of Pillar Church in Holland, Michigan. It's a healthy pastor, a healthy staff, a healthy church.
That's
kind of
great.
That's great.
Now we know. We know
Michigan. Who knew? Michigan.
And there are churches like that, but they're just not going to get a whole lot of attention. And John would be he'd be flustered if he knew that I mentioned his name. He don't want this kind of attention, right? So.
One of the things that has brought a lot of healing to Bob and I is we got a puppy. And
we did.
She just brought so much joy and so much present moment centeredness. I kind of want to go back to something you said earlier. You were talking about that we actually live these really blessed lives in this day and age. We have air conditioning and great medical care and all of these things that we can often take for granted. And a lot of times I feel like our threats actually are existential threats. They're threats that are kind of like coming in from the outside, that in all reality, I'm safe. The tribe from the, 50 miles away is not going to come and attack me. Yeah. I'm actually I am physically safe. But I feel this threat. And so I think that a lot of what we have to navigate is how we are able to heal from that. And one of the areas that I've really been reading about lately is called moral injury. And I would really encourage anyone who's experienced a lot of the things that we're talking about today to really study on moral injury. But the way to heal moral injury that I've found and I've read about and through the research that's really different is you have to find ways to be present centered. So you have to actually try to find a way to really come back into your body. So go watch a funny movie, play with a puppy, go for a walk, go for a bike ride. You have to actually separate yourself from what feels like the threat, especially when that threat is not a tribe coming at you from 50 miles away, but it's more of an existential threat of what will be said about me on social media, what will happen here, what will happen there, what will this outcome be? And I feel like that's really important. I knew that Bob was, I knew that our puppy, her name's Mabel. She's adorable. And
a little sassy.
I knew that Bob was she'd melted his heart. He came in and he said, I was sitting in the backyard and Mabel came running up to me with my glasses, his eyeglasses in her mouth. And he goes, thank you, Mabel. And then he puts them on and he tries to go get in the car and he looks down, he realizes it's blurry. And then he realized she'd eaten out both of the lenses of his glasses. Oh, no. And he comes in and he's just laughing. He's like, she ate the lenses out of my glasses. And it's one of those moments that it's like to just be able to hear the laughter of someone, to be able to just feel like you're present. I feel like these are all signs of healing. And when I've worked with victims of human trafficking, one of the biggest signs that I found that they're healing, this is how I know a child's getting into a healthier place, is that they start dreaming again. They start telling me about what their future is going to look like. They're getting their hope back. They're starting to think, I could have a future. I could graduate high school. I could do something. And I can start have enough safety now that I could actually start not just being in survival mode, not just thinking about my day and not just worried about it, but I'm dreaming and I'm planning for a future. And I feel like that those are signs also of a healthy leader, of somebody who's, like you said,
Laughing,
enjoying themselves, like just being able to live in the moment.
Yeah. I love that you named that, because I think you're getting at like healing from trauma 101, right? And you named survival mode. That's the mode that we live in when we're living in fight or flight, when we're constantly looking at enemies, when we're polarized. And a lot of us who've experienced spiritual abuse stay there for years. Those of us who have experienced moral injury can stay there for years.
Yeah.
What you're saying is the present moment might be the key, right? Which is to say, we get stuck in the past. We get stuck our frozen past. And what we do in therapeutic work, and there are other ways of getting at this, is we invite people to connect with their bodies, to connect with their laughter, to connect with joy, to shift from survival mode to joy mode. And we'll often say, go for a walk, get a dog, go on a Ferris wheel.
Get a hobby.
Go on a roller coaster.
Good. Roller coasters are good for your brain. Lots of dopamine.
Yeah. So connect to the present moment, connect to laughter, connect to nature, connect to beauty, connect to your heart. And so that's profoundly healing. And I love that you brought up Mabel, because I think for a lot of folks who've experienced harm or abuse, that's a pathway to joy. So good for Mabel. Good for you.
Yes. Good for Mabel. I'd like us to end on where we're all on the screen, because I want to do an exercise here. One of our last guests shared with us they work with a lot of people with recovering from spiritual abuse, and that not only can they not go to church, they can't even listen to worship music because it's traumatic. And I was reminded of a time when I couldn't form prayers. I didn't know how to form words of prayers, so I could only pray like Psalm 23 or the Our Father. And I was wondering, Chuck, if you would share with the people that are listening a prayer that might be healing to them. Church might not be a place where they feel safe, but language that they can have. Would you share a healing prayer with us?
Yeah, so I love breath prayers. I'd love to connect the prayer with inhaling and a long exhale. Because when we're breathing like that, we're connected to what we call the ventral vagal system of our body, the joy center, the Mabel center. And so we're in that place where we're able to, you're not breathing if you're in a traffic accident, right? That's where you're having your hands on your steering wheel and you're not breathing at all. But, when we're breathing, we know we're safe. We know we're not under threat. We know we're not in survival mode. So there's an old prayer in the Celtic tradition that I'll invite folks to. I won't invite people to inhale and exhale now, but maybe your listeners can return to this and sort of join me and others who've used this prayer before me over the many, many years in inhaling and exhaling. It goes like this: calm me, O Lord. That's the inhale. As you stilled the storm, exhale. Still me, O Lord. Inhale. Keep me from harm. Exhale. Let all the tumult, inhale, within me cease. Exhale. Enfold me, Lord. Inhale. In your peace. Exhale. Now, I did that quickly. I would go a lot slower if we were doing it long inhales and long exhales. Calm me, O Lord, as you still the storm. Still me, O Lord, keep me from harm. Let all the tumult within me cease. Enfold me, Lord, within your peace. It's an old prayer. It's a beautiful one, isn't it?
That's
Very beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you for sharing this episode with us in this conversation.
Thank you for listening. Thanks for being a part of Project Healed. We're trying to just create safe places to have the tough conversations to help us create language to heal. And I know that Dr. Chuck DeGroat did that for us today. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope that today was a healing day for all of you.